Okay, good morning. We are Yoreh, Deah, Tarovis. We're in the middle of Kuf Hey, and we are starting with Seif Zayin. Okay, mixtures of Isser and Heter, Zayin. Okay, we're going to have a little bit of a fine-tune or better understanding about, if not more confusing, understanding of Chatichas Atzma Nasas Nevela, Chanan. Chatichas Nasas Nevela. Sorry, Zod Zayin. Ha de Chatichas Isser Oseret Chaverta Benegiata. Okay, until now we learned you have two pieces of meat that are getting grilled together, a piece of treif and a piece of heter. So one could be oser, the other one, if they're touching, right? And it depends if it's fatty, not fatty, could be natila, kulo, fine.
Being grilled or being put on a plate?
So it could be either one depending on the case, but we're talking about it's on the fire. But basically it's being grilled together. That's what we had until now. So now when we say it's oser one to another, it's davka kish isura machmat atzma. The only time one piece of meat can treif another piece of meat while it's on the grill, right? The maximum heat. You can't get hotter. It's on the grill. It's right over the fire. They're touching each other. It's only one can transfer the blias of isser from one piece of treif meat to a kosher piece of meat, right? You're cooking next to your non-Jewish coworker, and you're on the same grill, and he's using his meat, you're using your meat. Kagon nevela. It's a piece of nevela. When the isser is, the whole thing is asser. The whole thing was born isser. It was born, once it was shechted as a nevela, once it was treif, once it comes from a non-kosher animal. The item itself is mamash treif, not because it became treif from another blia, from something else. Okay. O basar b'chalav, or a case of, now what's the case of basar b'chalav? It's a big machlokas achronim, what the cases we're talking about. We'll come back to this in a moment. Aval. So anytime one thing can make another thing, we're talking about dry heat. For something to transfer from one to another, it has to be asr itself. Otherwise, it's not going to happen. Aval im ein ba isser elo shebala mimakom acher eina oseret acheret anogat ba. Let's say you have a piece of kosher meat. It's on the fire next to another piece of meat, which became asr. It became asr because and some blias of isser got in there, whether it's chaylev, whether it's treif, whether it's dam, whatever the isser is, maybe karbonos, whatever, lina, whatever your case might be, it only has a blia of isser. And so now this whole piece of meat, so the one that has the blia of isser, the whole piece of meat is mamish asr. You can't eat any of it because wasn't when it became asr with the blia, it wasn't bato b'shishim. So the whole piece of meat is mamish asr. If that piece of meat touches a kosher piece of meat, there's no transfer. You don't even have to remove kadei klipa, kadei natila, nothing. You rinse it off maybe at the most, and you rinse it off and it's 100% kosher because it doesn't transfer. It's dry heat. Afilu imitzlu yachad. Even if they're being grilled together on the same grill and they're touching each other. B'med dvarim amurim. Don't get too excited. Hold on. That's keshabala iser she'enu mefafea. That's if it became aser when there's no fat involved. Right? Really the ikar din we finished with. We learned it, done. Now he's just pointing out one other thing to consider. So normally if we're talking about meat, is going to be a problem because of fat. That's just a minor detail which puts a wrench in most cases, but it's still a minor detail in understanding the basic principle. But if the piece of treif that's next to your kosher piece of meat became isser with a blia with fat, there was fat mixed in with the blias of isser. So then we assume it traveled, that fat made that item travel all the way through. Oh yeah, second. About bala min advarim shemafafim b'tivan kagon shuman, such as fat. Oseret chaverta bin bitzli bin binogad zo cham becham. So even if it's yad saletabo and it's touching and it's yad saletabo, it's still cham. So maybe we're talking about a din kli rishon, or it's mamish on the fire. Oh, the tachtona chama, the elyona tzonenet, and even if the bottom one is the hot one because it's tataz gaver, and the top one is the one that's cold, sheha iser abalua be'atzma mefafeya, the iser itself that got absorbed in there is fatty iser. So then v'yotze michaticha lechaticha, then it could jump from one chaticha from one piece to another. So just take a step back for a sec. Again, what we learned, we learned until now the concept of chatichas nasas nevela. When something becomes a bli of iser, and ein shishim kenegdo, so the whole piece of meat becomes aser. So we have the famous machloket between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah. By shari surim, do we look at the whole thing like a nevela? So you see, even according to the Ramah, who's machmer, the only time we say chanan is iser, like we have to worry about it, is if it's cooked in a pot by bishul. Comes out that whenever we talk about chanan, the only time that makes it more machmer to be batal that now you need shishim keneged the whole new chaticha, the chatichas nasas nevela. It's only by bishul if it gets put into a pot, because then there's the option for the entire piece of what became aser to travel. All the iser can come together, travel out of it, and move into the next thing because you have a liquid medium. Here, whenever we talk about chanan, if it's dry heat, there's never the chumrah of chanan. Because it's true the whole piece becomes aser. The iser got belua, you had a piece of meat, kosher meat that got blia of a little bit of iser, but it wasn't batal b'shishim, so the whole thing becomes aser. But now when that piece of meat touches another piece of meat, if there's no medium for the transfer of the entire piece of meat, because it's dry heat, so it's only going to transfer where it touches, then we don't say it's mamish nevela. It's a chumrah of chanan. Chanan's a chumrah, but really, it's mikar din. It's not mamish nevela. It's just it was a kosher piece of meat with a belia. In other words, don't take it too literal, and therefore, when it's only nogeya one to another, it's never going to be able to transfer all of the belua iser into the new item, your kosher food, and therefore, even where it's touching, we're going to assume it has its effect of transferring the blia of iser is going to be less than shishim, even on the surface. So you don't even have to do kadei latila or kadei klipa, nothing. That's chanan.
If you cook a piece of kosher meat in a
Yeah.
goulash with old tray, and then you took out the kosher meat.
Do you mind asking me afterwards?
Oh, okay.
Sorry, it's going to be a long case. Fine. So that's now. What's the case of basar b'chalav? So this is interesting because we know everybody holds that chanan by basar b'chalav. So this is a machlokas achronim, perhaps rishonim, how to understand the case of basar b'chalav, where let's say you have a piece of meat and some milk drips into, or milk is not fatty, so milk drips into the piece of meat, and now the meat, it wasn't batul b'shishim, let's say. Let's say you were grilling a piece of meat and a few drops or a cup of milk spills on the meat, so, and it wasn't batul b'shishim. So that entire piece of meat, even according to the Shulchan Aruch, right, we're talking about the rice over here, even according to the Shulchan Aruch, basar b'chalav, we say chanan, no questions, right? And therefore, if you're going to drop it into a piece of soup, now you need shishim keneged the entire piece of meat. Right? But for this halacha, if it's once this piece of meat became iser of basar b'chalav, and now it's on dry heat, touching to another item, do we say, um, do you need to remove anything, kadei netila, or nothing whatsoever? So on this, it's a machlokas achronim. It's pretty split, big heavyweights on both sides. The Taz, the Gra, and Chazon Ish and others. You can look in Psakim Mechuvas in the section of Tzad Yibet in his letter Ot. He does Ot Yod. That's where he discusses it. Anyway, he brings down a slew on both sides. So the Taz and the Gra, Chazon Ish and others, crazy, they all write. Even in this case, is mutter. Because even by basar b'chalav, when we say chanan, it's not mamish nevela. We treat it on a level deraisa that the whole thing becomes mixed with the meat and milk, but still, to transfer onto another item through dry heat, you still need the potential of all of that milk now to go into the next piece of meat. In other words, it's a less literal understanding of nevela. That new basar b'chalav, it's not 100% the same as nevela. And therefore, it would be mutter in our case by dry heat transferring. You had a piece of meat that got milk mixed in, it wasn't batel b'shishim. Now you're grilling it and it's touching another kosher piece of meat. That next piece of meat is 100% kosher. You don't even have to do kadei netila or klipa, nothing. The shach, and along with him is Kaf HaChaim, Aruch Shulchan, and others, understand, whoa. By basar b'chalav, that's for sure nevela. That's what we're all used to. That's Issa Deraisa. And the whole mixture now changes. Even the meat in the basar b'chalav becomes mamish like nevela, mamish, and therefore they were hold that it's, in that case, it would, if dry heat touching another piece of meat, it would osir it kedei netila, right? Unless it would be fatty. Again, we did learn that lemaisa we generally assume all meat is fatty, so therefore it would have to be bekulo. It would have to be batel b'shishim, or it would usher the whole thing. And if it's not and even if it's batel b'shishim, you still have to remove kedei netila at the area where it's touching. So that's a quick synopsis on understanding. So it's a machlokas what the machaber is saying. Exactly. But that is the machlokas, the tachshas, and everyone else on how to understand. And nobody wants to argue with the Shulchan Aruch, and everyone is trying to understand the halacha. This kula, this whole seif, is based on a Rashba and a Tosfos. And the Rashba himself says, if I'm not mistaken, it's even by basar b'chalav. You'll see that meforish in the Yoreh Hagra. And so therefore, okay. It really boils down to a machlokas rishonim and which ones you follow. Okay. It's the Taz who points out, in our case, you don't even have to remove kedei klipa, mamish nothing. Okay, everyone agrees as far as I know. That's a good place to see it. Let's see, I think. Now, according to the Taz, he just points out, but the Shulchan Aruch himself writes, it could be a problem of machmas atzman by basar b'chalav. So that's the case. So the Taz and his whole group with him explain the case in the Shulchan Aruch that's a problem of basar b'chalav is when you have a piece of meat that's on the grill with a piece of cheese that's on the grill or over the fire, and they're touching each other. So since they're both touching each other, to each other, it's going to osir each other kedei netila. But it's not the normal case that we're usually referring to of basar b'chalav. On that, it's a machlokas achronim. Okay, let's continue.
But if you had a piece of meat that is cooked in a pot of milk, that would be different than the piece of meat that just had...
No difference according to those achronim. No difference. 100. Yeah, we can look at it together if you want afterwards. But okay. Because at the end of the day, you take that piece of meat out of the pot of milk, You rinse it off, there's no mamashas of milk, there's nothing but blias of milk in there, and no blia can transfer from one piece of meat to another, according to the Taz, without sauce. And yeah, exactly. Fine. So that may have been a little bit new for our understanding or not. Fine tunes us back to Tzadi Bet, so I am shown. Okay, now where do we leave off? Sorry, I don't even know where we left off. I think we left off with the Haggah, no? With the Ramah? Okay, so that's towards the end of Kuf Hei Zayin. Haggah, v'kol ze b'shtei chatichos. This entire heter of dry to dry, of meat, of a piece of meat to a piece of meat, that's only if it's a piece of meat to a piece of meat. And therefore, there's no transfer. The blia of one doesn't transfer into the other. However, so then you might say, what about kalim? Why should any kli be a problem? A kli has, anytime you're going to do dry heat with a kli, the kli itself is mutter. It's the blia that's in there. So he says, aval, kli, shabala iser. But anytime you have a kli that has iser in there, any treif pot or basar b'chalav issues, oser heter shenogeabo. That doesn't have this kula. The kli could transfer its blia, even if it's dry heat, like a skewer or whatever it is, into the item it's touching. Afilu be'isr she'enu shamin. Even if we're talking about an isr, it's a piece of meat that has no fat whatsoever, it would still be, it would still osir it. Yeah, okay. So what's the difference? So, I mean, obviously we know that we know that this is a obvious halacha. We all know this. What's the question? But just to help understand a little bit of machalik, the difference is because one way to explain it is when you have a kli is basically like an open receptacle. We kind of view it almost as if it's empty inside, and therefore anything that's balua inside can easily go out and penetrate into the isser food. But if it's two foods touching each other, the food, each piece of food, or the isser food, the food that has chaticha that has isser balua inside, we look at it as a full piece of meat. You cut it open, there's a full piece of meat inside. There's no empty chamber, so therefore it's not easy for the isser just to jump out by itself. Or it has to go through the meat, or it's with the meat that comes out. It's a lot more, it's not as easy for it to transfer from another piece of meat, which is organic food matter, than basically a still inorganic, empty receptacle per se, where the blia can just jump right out. But, okay, that is, okay. I don't know if he tries to explain it a little differently, but yeah. And one has its own, basically it's the same. It's basically, I kind of basically explained two different explanations into one, combined it. Anyways, so that's basically an understanding for how that works. Let's go to, I think we're ready to go to chet. Kuya shetzalo b'chelbo. Now, we know a kidney, if it has chaylev on there, right? Part of the kidney has chaylev. So therefore you have to remove it, and there's the membrane you have to remove, which has chaylev attached to it. So a kidney. Kuya shalai b'chelbo. But you roasted it together, you grilled it together. Eina oser ela kadei klipa shehakrum mafsik. So we say that there's a membrane. Now that membrane has chaylev attached to it, so you have to remove the membrane, right? We learned that before by chaylev. But if you didn't, so we say you have to remove kadei klipa. The membrane doesn't make it go bekula, not kadei natila. The membrane kind of shuts it out, makes a barrier, and you only have to worry about that. V'hagav v'yesh osrim, and some say no, it's yesh osrim, because maybe it does go through, or maybe it's ripped, and therefore it penetrates. So some say it's now the whole kidney is aser because it penetrates, and there's nothing you can do about it anymore. V'chen noagim, ve'ein l'shanos, and that's the halacha, so you better make sure before you grill it or cook it, you remove that membrane. V'dino kishar chelev, and it has the same din as any chelev, hanitzlei mabasar, it's cooked together. V'im nidbashal kach hakulya nasas nevela, and if you cook it like that, so now the whole kulya becomes nevela, right? This is the Ramah who says Chanan by Shari Surim. V'tzarich shishim neged kula. Now you're going to need shishim, not only keneged the chelev, but even shishim keneged the whole kulya. Right? You cook it by itself, becomes Chanan, and then you cook it again into another pot, and now now you need keneged kol kulya. Again, you need shishim now, even though it's iser balua, because again now we're cooking it in a liquid medium, right, as opposed to the previous seif. Vehu adin bekrum sha'ala yoteret, and the same thing by the liver. The krum is also the same halacha. Okay, let's go on. Kavav. Now, about salty. If you have something that's very salty, and it can't be eaten because it's so salty, dina karoteach. The halacha is it has a din of roteach. And the Shach just points, says, look back at what we learned earlier in Sadi Aleph, that he points out over there. So it has to be Eino nechal machmas mocho, we just said that, and it only becomes a problem if it's been sitting in this salty brine, so that you can't eat it, it's too salty, for 18 minutes, or whatever is the zman of malicha, more or less, whatever it is, but generally we assume 18 minutes. That's the minimum. If it's less than 18 minutes, there's no problem. It didn't get roteach yet. Right? It's like you put something on a stove, it's still cold, and so it takes a number of minutes, depending how big the pot is. Whether it could be a couple minutes or it could be 10 minutes, who knows? So, or more. So that's by a pot. But here, by maliach, it's shir kadei malicha, 18 minutes, fine. And then, umafi lesar kadei klipa. And then, once if you're going to be cooking with, ki'ilu cooking through salt, it's just being salted. So then it has the din of, it's osar kadei klipa. Okay. Just to mention from the Shach, it's ayin sham. I don't want to get too bogged down, but if you remember, we're certainly talking about a case. I mean, what we said certainly applies to a case when it's already been salted from blood, and now you're salting it again. A fresh piece of kosher meat that you can eat. It's already been removed the blood. Now you put it with salt. So we said, everyone says, so now it needs kadei shir malicha of 18 minutes. If the blood was never removed, so then it's a whole machloket over there, we learned, that maybe it even starts to become keroteach immediately, because with the blood it has different properties. But anyway, normally we're talking about 18 minutes. Fine. V'imhu shameh. So again, now, we're talking about it's heavily salted, so it's meliach keroteach. Imhu shuman hagid, v'knuknos shabo, v'akrumos. Now, if we're talking about it has shuman over there from the gid and the membranes v'chulei of chaylev, yesh lahachmer lahatzricham netilas makom. So how much do you have to remove? We said before, so if there's no fat, it's kadei klipa. If it is fatty, you have to remove kadei netila, which is generally what we have to worry about, because we're generally machmer, right? We're not sure. And we don't say kula over here, mi'ikar adin, because the shuman of the gid is only in Isser Derabanan, so we're a little bit more meka. But generally, we say shishim anyway. That's what the Shach points out. The imhu chelev mamash, but if it's talking about chelev daraisa, not darabanan, then we need tzarich shishim levatlo. Then you need shishim. That's the distinction. Okay, v'im habasar shenimlach imohu shamen. Now, let's say the piece of meat that we're talking about has fat. The meat became fatty. Really, it was a lean piece of meat, but now it's a fatty piece of meat because it's taking a piece of the shuman derabanan from shuman agid. So then, tzarich shishim levatlo. So then you still need shishim. Velito mimakom shenaga, because then it has a status of fatty. And then, okay. Now, anytime we say by malicha, by shuman, so you have to take two chumras to the extreme. Anytime we're talking about malicha, so let's say we're talking about it could be fatty. So then, not only it must be number one, shishim keneged the chalev, because it's the salt is connecting the two. So you and right, fat is mefafeya. So you have to worry about shishim, or the whole piece of meat we say is aser. That's one extreme. The other extreme is the other side is we have to say, well, they're touching. Wherever it's touching, it might jump around, but it might not. And therefore, it won't be mavliya equally throughout the whole piece of meat. It might only just stay on the other side of the border where it's touching the meat. So there you have to remove velito mimakom shenaga in the area where it's touching kedei netilas makom ulafachot klipa. So wherever it's touching by malicha, right? We had this similar by roasting. You always have to, wherever it's touching, for sure you have to remove. By roasting, we said kedei natila. By salting, he says natila or klipa, which is a very strange expression. Which one is it? You're the Shulchan Aruch. Decide for us. So the Yoreh points out he wasn't so, he had trouble deciding, so he just left it as you can pick. Because, right, before we learned earlier, kedei klipa, and that was based on the Rambam, because the Shulchan Aruch was talking about a case of kachush. So in a case of kachush, for sure you could be mekel by kedei klipa. Our case, it has shuman, and he was not sure which way to go. Should it be kedei klipa or kedei natila when there's fat involved? Yeah. So anyways, fine. We'll leave that. Let's keep going. One second. Here, I'll just point out, we're going to see more about this. Oh, we're out of time. We're going to see more about this soon when we continue. When we finish the rest of this siman. But just to point out over here, if you look in the middle of the shach, just to point out, it gets a bit confusing, so we're not going to delve into it completely. But the Beis Yosef, and we're going to see it when we keep reading in the Seifim ahead, he says the only time something salty could oser, when you have two pieces of meat touching each other and one of them is salty, the only time it could impart iser to the heter is if the iser is salty and the iser is the one that's, well, so this is a question mark, but the Beis Yosef writes, Dafka binan shehi ha-iser shamen, only when, or for it to penetrate this amount. We'll see, but the Shach says the only time it can actually penetrate from one to another, not only when it's shamen, but also when both of them are salty. If the iser is, so if everything is salty and there's shamen on both sides, no question, it imparts. The machloket achronim and how to understand, and we're going to see if one's on top and one's on the bottom, that's going to be our main distinction, and that's how some explain or disagree with the shach, whatever. It all depends if the iser is on top or the iser is on bottom. In other words, we'll see, it could be only one of them needs to be salty. The shach says both of them need to be salty, but some say as long as the top one, or most will say, as long as the bottom one is salty, and even if the top one is not, then it's going to be a problem. Kaf chet, and it's towards the end of kaf chet. But I think it better we'll leave that as we continue reading the Seifim, and just know that it's a little bit of a machloket if only one of them is salty. Besides, it's not so nogea halacha. I don't know, maybe we'll just stop in the middle. Yeah, we're just going to stop. Sorry. Whoa.